Hello guys and welcome to Rayl Deal Games. Today I'll be talking about why I play so many vintage video games. Now real quick before we get into this, let's talk about the difference between the term vintage and retro. Many people, and I have myself been in this category before as well, use retro and vintage interchangeably, and I think this makes a lot of sense because when someone says a retro video game, they just mean a video game that is old or old feeling. The difference between the terms is very simple. A vintage game is something that was actually made in the past versus a retro game trying to emulate the past. Now, before I use these terms interchangeably, much like most people, but they are very different things. When you play more and more vintage games, you start to realize the difference in the design methodology and philosophy behind why they designed the games they did. Before, with vintage games, they're old looking and feeling because that's what they had. Back then, they weren't old or old looking. They were new, and they felt new too. Now, today I'm going to be talking about certain genres that I like from this era and why I like them so much, and classic types of design that retro games don't actually replicate, nor do they try to, nor would they want to. Let's start with one of my favorite genres, and a genre that really started to blow up starting in 1992 with Wolfenstein 3D. I've been actually talking about this genre a lot this month. That's the boomer shooter. It wasn't called the boomer shooter back then. It was called, at first, the Doom clone. Later, the FPS. Later, the arena shooter. And more contemporarily, the boomer shooter. Now, the reason why this genre went through multiple waves is because, starting with Wolfenstein 3D, and no, that was not the first FPS game. I know this. You don't need to correct me in the comments, but it is the first one that really started taking off. Starting with Wolfenstein 3D, this was a brand new type of genre. The idea that you have a first-person perspective on a shooter. Before it was Contra, right? That's a, for the time, third-person shooter, although we wouldn't call that anymore. We'd call it a run and gun, and they called it a run and gun back in the day. But it was a third-person perspective of a shooter. The first-person perspective puts you in the boots of the person. Now, these early ones were very much 2D. They tricked you into thinking they were 3D, but Wolfenstein 3D was really just the third game, and Doom were 2D games, by and large. As time went on, the boomer shooter turned into a 3D space. Very early 3D, like Quake and Unreal Tournament being one of my favorite boomer shooters of all time. Possibly my favorite one. It would definitely be a toss-up between it, 1993's Doom, and Doom 2016, for sure. Now, the reason why I like this era of time so much is that it was a very much an action-focused era. I think a lot of times when people look back and talk about older boomer shooters, they talk about getting lost looking for keys and key hunting. And really, it's just the bad or poorly designed areas of boomer shooters where this effect would happen. Or it's a sign of the player not paying attention to their environment that well. I can think of only one time in the base game of Doom 2 where it's easy to not know how to progress a level, and that's because of a teleport path sequencing and a certain level of Doom 2. In Wolfenstein 3D, it's only a thing that happens in the prequel chapters, which were added later, and the expansion content of Spear of Destiny. Now, I think that's a little bit more forgivable because it was more experimental design, whereas the later boomer shooters, where confusing design might exist in Hexen or Hectic or whatever, it's more just a mistake. And I think mistakes in design happen all the time. It's not really a core feature of the genre, though. Getting lost and hunting for keys, that's not what they were designed to do. The keys were a MacGuffin to get you to go to the next area, the next murder room. That's all they existed for. And when you play those older games at higher difficulty, it is the flow and spawning of demons and enemies that really show you where you need to go. In fact, dead bodies on the floor show you where you had been, to clue you in that you don't need to be there anymore. Or, if you remember there being a room back there, that is where you need to go. The enemies are the arrows, versus what a more modern design game would be, of just putting an arrow above your head like BioShock in 2007, or constant map markers directing you where you need to go. What I like about vintage games and why I play them so much is that they do not hold your hand. If anything, they expect you to reach out blindly in the dark without a torch and find your own way in the world, as it should be. Now, don't get me wrong, I like modern games like anyone else. I'm a variety gamer through and through. I play old and new. And sometimes you do want something to guide your way through the game, because you don't want to have to think that much about it. But most of the time, I'm not that way. If a game is not asking me to use my brain, I lose interest very, very quickly. Now, something else that I think vintage games do far better than modern games is emphasize gameplay and put it in the forefront. I think the best example of this would be arcades. Now, arcades are criticized often for being quarter munchers, and the bad arcade cabinets were. Don't get me wrong, they all were doing it. They were trying to get your money, for sure. But the ones that were well designed had fair difficulty curves. Now, fighting games were not that. They were quite often overtuned to get your money and get you out of there. But really, they wanted you to play the multiplayer. They wanted you to play with someone else so that they could double dip into the money, right? But that made it a skill-based economy. I really like old fighters. I even like playing the PvE experience of old fighters like Mortal Kombat, which is notorious for cheating, like most fighters of the era. Although I would argue Mortal Kombat cheats less than some other fighters that existed within the arcade. But we will talk about that later in later videos on the channel. Now, vintage game design is not just the arcade for MK, as it also involves the 3D era, which is quite probably my favorite era of Mortal Kombat. I mean, my favorite game in the series is Mortal Kombat Deception, which I think has everything I like about vintage game design. It provides you multiple ways to play the game and also exposes you to the story in a way that requires exploration and discovery at the behest of the player. I don't like the way the 7th generation, which I think is the cutoff for vintage games now. I mean, eventually the 7th generation will be called vintage as well, but I think we're probably about 10 years from that. I think games need to be at least 20 years old before you're going to call them vintage. At least 30 is probably better, like a better time frame, but we'll call like the PS2, I think, the top half of the vintage, because some of that does feel old. If you don't want to count that, that's fine. I'm not going to really be talking about PS2 games beyond the Deception comment today. But when games went into the 7th generation, they started streamlining game design to the point of hallwaying you to the next objective, pointing you to where you need to be, not only in gameplay mechanics, but also story mechanics. Now, I start to see this, you start to see this in 2001, which does fall within, I guess I am going to talk about another PS2 game today, with Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is one giant hallway. It is. And it was criticized back in 2001 for this because older Final Fantasy games did not necessarily do that. Final Fantasy 1 especially didn't do that. You can get lost in Final Fantasy 1 trying to figure out where to go. And other Final Fantasy games would allow you to go to multiple locations. Now, in the grand scheme of things, those overworlds are big, long hallways, pretty much, but they don't feel that way because they have a grandiosity of the world to them. Now, Final Fantasy shows this trend of trying to force-feed the story to the player, a trend that I would say probably really starts taking off after Metal Gear Solid, which is a vintage game. A solid one, you could say. And I think this is something where you can kind of see these design trends happening, the streamlining of game design principles, something that I actually don't think is necessarily entirely a problem. You have to have some amount of streamlined games to cater to people who are not super familiar with games. You need some streamlined experiences so that you can create hardcore players down the line. You need shallow pools of water to learn how to swim, right? Now, I think the real side of Final Fantasy that really shows what the series is about would be the PS1 era, the SNES era, the NES era, and my favorite game of all time, Final Fantasy Tactics, a game that has a very brutal difficulty spike that can, if you did not diversify your saving behavior, brick your entire save. And I talked about this a little bit briefly in my Doom 2 review, but that part is Riovan's Castle, which is quite possibly one of my favorite parts of Final Fantasy Tactics. It is a difficulty spike. It can be tough, especially if you don't know what's coming. And when you enter Riovan's Castle, you're in a sequence of fights that you cannot back out of without reloading a save. Game overing. If you overwrote your save, well, then you're locked in. And it's tough. It is not hard, not an easy thing, and it's capped off by a boss fight with Y-Graph that can be quite challenging, especially if you have spec'd Ramza to be more of a support character and less of your damage-dealing tank. Now, I love Final Fantasy Tactics for this, though, because it requires the player to think strategically beyond the confines of the game. You got to think strategically within the levels, but also strategically within your saves. You do not want to get locked into an area with poor resourcing. You want to be able to revert to an old save, because you see, in Final Fantasy Tactics, if you level up early, you grind early, you can actually make the game harder for yourself because your equipment will not match the difficulty of the enemies present. In fact, I think one of the more difficult ways to play Final Fantasy Tactics is to grind to level 99 in Chapter 1, because then your equipment is terrible as you go through the game, and you have to fight way harder enemies just in general matches until you have properly scaled in the late game. And so it's kind of like flips the difficulty curve, where the early game is super, super hard and the late game gets easier. But I'll talk about Final Fantasy Tactics in a future series of videos that I want to make whenever the remaster, port, remake, whatever it is, finally gets announced. We all know it's on the horizon. I also think PS1 era horror is way better than a lot of modern horror. And I think you see this in the indie space a lot with retro throwback horror, like what Puppet Combo does, what we see with games like Elisa and other things like that. I mean, we had Crow Country last year, I think. Crow Country had Signalis before that. A lot of people call back to these tank control, fixed camera angle horror games that classic RE is. I think they've done horror really well here, because a lot of horror game design is the obfuscation and the limitation of game mechanics on the player. A restriction of saves, a restriction of ammo, a restriction of movement and mobility tools. And I think this even goes further when you start to put horror in an immersive sim situation, such as what happens in System Shock 2. Imagine that, a horror immersive sim with soft locking and hard locking possibilities. You will only get that in a vintage game. You will never get that in a modern video game these days. And System Shock 2 is one of my favorite horror games as a result. It's such an atmospheric, exploration-based game that BioShock 2 is the streamlined version of, and I'm happy BioShock, not BioShock 2 exclusively, but BioShock as a series is a streamlined version of that. I'm happy exists for that reason. I just wish System Shock 2 had more modern fans, because it truly is something special. These genres that I have talked about today, boomer shooter, arcade, JRPG, horror, they really only exist within the indie sphere, although we are starting to see JRPG jump into the mainstream again with Metaphor Fantasio, Expedition 33, and things like that. But for a long time, they were gone, dude. Gone from existence and gone from new games within the indie sphere. Boomer shooters, ever since, I would say, about 2017, have started to really show up more consistently in the indie sphere. JRPGs, they were at the start of the indie revolution for sure. Horror games, all throughout the 2010s, really good stuff. Arcades, though, arcade-based games, I've definitely seen way more about recently than ever before, and I'm really hoping that the final genre I'm going to talk about in today's video gets a resurgence too. And that's the RTS, the real-time strategy game that yielded my second favorite game of all time, Age of Empires 2. I love Age of Empires 2, and I love this gameplay style. It's a hard style to pull off, much like a fighting game, and I would say it's probably harder to make a good RTS than it is to make a good fighting game. But we don't see RTSs anymore. And in fact, Age of Empires 2 is still getting content updates to this very day. It came out in 1999, guys, and it is getting DLC in 2025. It is crazy. Or 2024. I guess I need to double check when that DLC came out, that most recent one that I saw Spirit of the Law talk about. I love vintage games because they have all of my favorite genres, and to be sure, my genre choices were impacted by when I grew up in the PS2 era, and the fact that my dad did provide PC games for me to play. There's a reason I loved Baldur's Gate 3 so much, like so many other people who had never played that style of game before. I grew up playing Fallout 1 and 2, which I plan to make a video about later this year, and I love that CRPG flow and vibe. It's good. Isometric CRPGs are something else, and I'm happy that people got to appreciate it with Baldur's Gate 3, but Baldur's Gate 3 is not Fallout 1 or 2. I liked the amount of choice that you were given in Baldur's Gate 3. But when you condense Fallout 1 being about a 20-hour game when you know what you're doing, less if you know what you're doing, but on my first playthrough, I think it took about 20 hours. The individual value of choices in Fallout 1, I would say, is higher than Baldur's Gate 3 because they do impact the final conclusion story and the final pathway of your character. If you play in Fallout 1 a character that kills everybody, you'll be able to finish the game. And you can theoretically do this in Baldur's Gate 3, I think, as well, but the limitation of resources, I think, makes this way harder in Baldur's Gate 3. The freedom of player choice that exists in vintage games is uniquely higher than what retro games and modern games try to do. I think there's a lot of times that people try to make indie version of X. This is an indie Doom game. This is an indie version of Quake. This is an indie Final Fantasy throwback. This is an indie RE clone. These things try to replicate what existed in that vintage era, but they do not provide the player the supreme ability to fail. That's the big thing that separates vintage games from retro games, I think. The ability to fail. If I boot up XCOM UFO Defense, I can mess up my save so bad, it's impossible to win the game. And yeah, sure, that's frustrating. It can be. But you know why I like Souls games so much? It's because I can fail. I can fail 100 times in a row and slowly get better. You can't fail at a modern video game. Now, obviously, there's exceptions. XCOM 2, for instance, you can fail, but it wouldn't be an XCOM game if you couldn't fail. Roguelikes, I think they're so exciting and attractive for people because you can fail. You can fail a lot and get slightly better. But I would argue with the Souls-like and the roguelike, there's no game over. With a Souls-like, you get better, and you get to maintain your resources and slowly increase your stats and get a little bit more powerful, and you never actually get reset to the beginning. With a roguelite, key syllable there, light, not like. We're not talking about Capes of Quod, where there's a fail state. Light, with the meta progression elements, you're never actually restarting. But if you hardlock your save in Final Fantasy Tactics, you're going back to the beginning, pal. The very beginning. You mess up in XCOM UFO Defense, you're going to the very beginning. You mess up in an arcade cabinet, you're going to the very beginning. Now, obviously, this changes when you have save states, for sure. But a lot of the vintage games that exist on Steam don't have these save states. And I think it is beneficial to their design. When my friends and I have been playing the Mega Man series on the channel, and we do use the save states, don't get me wrong. We do. Which does tarnish the experience. We do it because we only get to play once a month, and we want to finish things. We don't want to get stuck on things and don't want to have to play Mega Man 2 weekends in a row for 2 months straight. It's a logistics thing for us to do that. However, I would be lying to say that it did not hurt the overall value of the game. And for my favorite ones that we played, Mega Man X, Mega Man 4, I'm happy to go back and play it without those tools because they are good games that are worth experiencing from beginning to end without assistance. I think we've gotten so addicted to grinding through everything, and I myself am guilty of this, that we view save states as an important part of porting a vintage game. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think save states and other modern conveniences when vintage games are brought forward do exist because of our fear of failure, our fear of wasting our time. But is time wasted when you enjoyed the process that got you there? When I play Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, Tactics, loads of other games that I played in my youth, I do challenge runs now that are permadeath. And when I fail, it's not that I wasted time, it's that I had a good time getting there. I feel this way when I play Magic Arena drafts, right? Did I waste my time when my draft deck is over? I went 5-3 and now I don't get to play it anymore? I wouldn't say so. The process of playing was the fun thing. And I think that's what vintage games really focused on. The process of play, not the completion. You beat a game back in the day, and yeah, you moved on. But you would go back to that game because that game was replayable. The playing of the game was what mattered, not the beating of it. And that's why I play so many vintage games. That's the video, my guys. I hope you enjoyed this midweek Wednesday video. I'll be talking about Doom Dark Ages on Friday. I want to thank you guys for watching my video, and I hope you really enjoyed my ruminations today. Let's talk about vintage games in the comments below. What do you guys think of vintage gaming? Do you also like it? I know I have a subsection of my audience that does, but I'm sure I have some of you out there who don't. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I'd love to have a discussion with you in the comments below. And while you're down there, do me a solid. Smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. I make new gaming videos every Wednesday and Friday, and I'd love to have you in my community. My big goal for the year is 10,000 subscribers, and with you on my side, I know I can get there, regardless of what you choose to do. Thank you guys for watching this video today, giving me your precious time. I really appreciate it, and I do hope you have an awesome day. Thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games, and I'll see you next time.